Diana DOBRIN. I'm Sustainable Innovation Lead at UrbanizeHub, and I'm going to take you through essentially the main mechanisms and best practices from Europe on what it means to do public-private partnerships for innovation with a focus on cities. What we're going to talk about today is the context of accelerating the green transition, the climate transition. Obviously, we're at a conference about energy, and renewable energy is obviously a big topic. And what we're going to talk about today is how we can mobilize these types of public-private innovation partnerships so that they can help us reach the climate transition a lot faster in cities. As I mentioned, I'm representing UrbanizeHub. UrbanizeHub is an organization that primarily deals with urban regeneration, participatory urbanism, and sustainable innovation for what it means to actually turn the cities that we want into the future that we dream of, but together, collaboratively with everyone at a local level. So I'm going to start with perhaps the importance of why we need to talk about public-private partnerships and innovation. As I'm quite sure a lot of you know, sustainability, climate neutrality, transition, all of these topics are quite high up on the agenda at the moment. But I guess the main question is, what do we actually do, and how do we actually reach all of these targets that we've set ourselves, the targets that have been set for cities to meet by 2030, 2050, and so on. And I have an image here in my back, and I'm quite curious to see if any of you have seen this before, if you can guess what this is. Maybe hands up if you know what this is. I realize it's quite an interesting metaphor that perhaps you weren't expecting. No? Okay. It's a bit harder to do it in, let's say, more of an interactive way. Essentially, what you see here in the back, it's called the carbon bathtub. So if you were to think of Earth's atmosphere essentially as a bathtub that it's constantly filling up, you can see on the right that basically carbon emissions, so anything kind of coming from all of the activities that we have in the world, are like an open faucet, right? They're pouring water into the bathtub non-stop. At the same time, on the left side, you have the sewage. You have forests, you have oceans, you have like the, let's say, planet's natural ways of trying to remove the excess water, to remove the excess carbon emissions from the atmosphere, right? But the problem, I guess, is that when you look at this bathtub, it's okay for the moment. Like, it's somewhat balanced, so to say. But the problem is that water is accumulating, and it's accumulating faster than it can be drained. And climate neutrality, essentially, and the goals that we have for our cities, for the world, for the planet, essentially means that we need to be able to balance that flow so that we can actually avoid having the bathtub running over and having too much water. And essentially, there are two ways that we can do that. On one hand is looking at the open faucet and trying to maybe close it off a bit, and that's what we can do by decarbonizing, so decarbonization, switching in terms of business models, in terms of technologies, switching to renewable energy, all of that stuff. That will help us basically emit less in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, we also have to think about how we can encourage our planet to adapt better to the activities and our basically human everyday activities that we need to continue doing. And that's the regeneration part. How do we support the planet's natural ecosystem? How do we support oceans, forests, and so on, so that they can actually be able to absorb as much as possible from the atmosphere? So this is the context for why we need to start talking a bit more about how we do this transition. Because whilst this can seem quite straightforward topics, the process together is not as easy. If we look at the world overall, we have probably around 70% of the world's population that is going to end up living in cities by 2050. And if we look at cities, basically, they're the planet's main emitters. They emit around 70% of the global CO2 emissions coming from cities. So in a way, they're the main problem, let's say, but also cities are also the biggest opportunity, because at the same time, about 55% of the GHG emissions that need to be reduced by 2030 under the EU's Green Deal can come from cities, because cities are the space, let's say, the hotbed for innovation and the space where we can address a lot of these emissions and if we ensure that we reach the climate neutrality. At the same time, if we look at what's happening in terms of our cities and how we're running them and everything we're doing, only about 5% of these urban emissions fall under the responsibility of local authorities. This is based on a UK study. Numbers are quite similar, for example, in the Nordic countries as well. So essentially what that means is, although the cities are such a big opportunity for addressing this climate transition, at the same time, local authorities at the city level, they can't really do that much in terms of their direct responsibility. That's only about 5%. But the trick is, if you start looking at the indirect influence that they have, it starts going up to 33% when we start talking about the policy that they can mobilize, and it goes up to 82% at the moment that local authorities decide to collaborate at an ecosystem level. And when they decide to collaborate with private entities, with the third sector, with academia, and so on. So essentially, what we can see is, although one actor might have quite a limited influence, so to say, to reduce emissions by themselves, that impact grows massively at the moment when you start collaborating and building partnerships. And that's the context we're in at the moment, because this process of the climate transition and these targets that we've set ourselves are very ambitious, and they can't necessarily be done, let's say, only in the way of the standard solutions that we've developed so far. So we need to start talking about innovation. And the EU Commission, innovation is quite high on the agenda in terms of all of the missions that they have and the funds that they're promoting. And one of these 5 levers of innovation that they've started talking a lot more about is governance. That looks not only at the public policies that we mobilize, but also at the partnerships and the ecosystems for change that we start seeing in the cities, at a regional level, even at an international level. So, what we're going to talk about today are public-private partnerships. And I guess the term of public-private partnerships has started to arise somewhere in the 50s in the US. At that point, public-private partnerships were primarily seen as a mechanism between the public sector and the NGOs to try to mobilize initiatives that were primarily linked to education or urban regeneration. So it was something that maybe, let's say, nowadays would fall under the sphere of CSR. And it started gaining a bit more importance in the UK in the 1975, something like that, when the UK at that time was starting to look for new ways to deliver infrastructure. So starting to look at bigger investments, investments for the long term, a lot more money, a lot more risk associated with it. So what do they mean? Essentially, public-private partnerships, I mean, obviously, it's in the name. It's an agreement between public and private entities. And the main point of these public-private partnerships is that you have both parties joining forces with the benefit and in the benefit of public value, whether that public value are services or it's about developing new infrastructure. Essentially, the idea is that you bring together different entities with different powers to be able to deliver better. And this leads to essentially a lot more efficiency, more of a sustainable way of developing initiatives, and you can do that by sharing the risks on one hand, the responsibilities, and also the resources that are involved. So in short, that is what we refer to when we talk about these public-private partnerships, also shortcut PPPs. So what does this mean? For the public sector, essentially, most of the times this means access to private capital, so having more space for them to attract more money. It means reduced budgetary pressure, so not only ensuring that they have money coming from the public sphere or from taxes or citizens or what they can usually collect. And it also means faster project delivery, because obviously partnering up with the private sector, you have a different way of delivering these projects. On the flip side, when we look at the private sector, what we see is that there's also a way for them to access state public projects, so having more of an impact at a larger scale. It's an opportunity for innovation, as I said, because a lot of the times maybe the projects that need to be delivered are not only the ones that have been delivered, so you start looking for innovative solutions rather than standard ones, and obviously a new market in that sense, or a new way of doing business or testing business models. And in the middle, you have the local communities, right? Because although you talk about public-private partnerships, and I guess the partners are either from the public and the private sphere, in the middle, the main point is that you want to support and help the local community. You have to be able to offer more efficient and better managed public services, modernized infrastructure, job creation, you name it, the impact at the end of the day has to be about the public value. And I guess I'm quite curious to see from all of you here in the room today, if we can switch on the interactive part. If you want to scan the QR code and go on the AHA slides, it's basically a variant of Menti. And I'm quite curious to see what's your experience so far with public-private partnerships, whether you've been involved in one, maybe you've heard of one but haven't necessarily done one, maybe it's the first time you hear about this. It would be quite good to know who I have with me today. Setting up a first PPP now, amazing. First time, welcome. Never done a PPP. I'm quite curious to see if we have any brave leaders who've actually tried this before. Okay, so I see most of the people are mainly falling at the end of the scale in terms of being quite a new topic. I'm going to give you maybe one more minute to see if we have anyone else completing that's giving us a different perspective. But yeah, it's somewhat expected. I guess there's also, we're going to see in a minute, there's also a bit of a difference in terms of how you refer to public-private partnerships, and I guess the common perception is usually that you haven't necessarily done one, although there are different ways of looking at what a public-private partnership can be outside of the big infrastructure projects as well. Okay, cool. So let's say that we're mostly in the space of discovering it at the moment. Thank you. Can we switch back to the slides, please? Cool. So then when we talk about public-private partnerships, to have a bit of a grounding, we essentially talk about connecting different responsibilities and different needs so that we can maximize that public value to the citizen that I was talking about. So you can think of it in a way as one person has a need, the other person has a resource, and vice versa. At the end of the day, plus minus basically comes somewhere in the middle, and that's the point of public-private partnerships. For the public sector, and by public sector here I mean government, ministries, local authorities, can be international agencies, it can even be more in the non-profit sector and NGOs. Their main point is that they need innovative solution, as I was mentioning. They need this funding for developing essentially better cities, but essentially the public resources are somewhat limited. They need to kind of modernize services, but the processes are quite difficult to move, they're quite bureaucratic. So the way for them is to look at how can they collaborate with the private sector to accelerate this type of development. On the other side, you have the private sector. For the private sector, here we talk infrastructure companies, we talk real estate developers, service providers, investment funds, startups, you name it, mostly the business sphere. For them here, the idea is that they have expertise, they have resources, essentially they have everything they need, let's say, to develop sustainable infrastructure or projects. But at the same time, the support that they need from the public sector, where we look at regulations, we look at permits and all of that stuff, all of those are quite bureaucratic. It's quite of an unstable environment. And essentially, they need the public authorities' support for them to be able to establish more secure and effective partnerships in the future. And in the middle, as I was saying, the idea is that the citizens will then be able to benefit from having a better city with more efficient services. Now, when we talk about these PPPs, I think, especially in Romania, the topic is somewhat still in the early stages. There are good examples of PPPs that have been developed, but the idea is that they're probably more of one-off examples than a common practice. The reality is that PPPs have been starting to become quite important at an European level quite recently. On one hand, we have the need from a financial perspective of mobilizing these public-private partnerships, because if we look at the Recovering and Resilience Facility, we see that with the expiration date next year, basically there's going to be a massive public funding gap that will actually be somewhat needed to be covered with support from other resources. So that's on one hand. For the public sector, that's a massive challenge coming up the way. At the same time, I mentioned climate neutrality, and the EU Commission has mobilized all of these missions around the targets for climate neutrality, what we're trying to achieve in terms of climate neutral cities by 2030, by 2050, the local mission, the national missions that are found in different countries, such as the one we have in Romania at the moment. All of these things, basically behind all of these targets, there are action plans, there are investment plans, there are projects that need to happen. And these projects essentially cannot happen if we only look at the balance sheet of municipalities and at the balance sheet of city halls. Simply put, the funding that they have available won't cover all of the projects needed for them to be able to meet those targets by 2030 or 2050. And that's where public-private partnerships essentially have started to be pushed quite, let's say, not aggressively, but yeah, they've started to be pushed quite a lot by the European Commission as a way to achieve the goals in a way that you look at partnerships as a way to fund it, but also as a way to have impact on the emissions in more of a sustainable way at an ecosystem level. And finally, when we look at PPPs, there's also the, let's say, maybe the less reactive and more proactive way of looking at it, where we think about the future and the cities that we want to build. And I guess, again, coming at a European level, we can have a look at the new European Bauhaus and what's happening with this vision for integrated urban development that's been starting to be pushed a lot on the agenda. And where, obviously, if we want to have cities that are going to be good for all, that are going to be sustainable and inclusive, and they're going to be built in a cohesive and a coherent way, then we need to involve everyone. And it can't just be about the public sector doing everything. It needs to come in a collaboration. So the idea is that, basically, these PPPs, at the end of the day, they're a good tool because they can help you figure out that rather than going independently, and perhaps for a lot of us, even if you come from the public sector or the private sector, that can mean a lot of risks associated with wanting to do something innovative and wanting to break the mold. You can do that in partnership. And when you do that in partnership, essentially you start to learn how you can manage the risks associated with different types of investment, and you can see that in a partnership, that risk starts to diminish. And by risk, what we mean is that essentially when we think about the future, there's only so much that we can control, right? Risks essentially represent this possibility that at a later stage, a future event basically may negatively impact your objectives, whether that's from a funding perspective, whether that's from a delivery perspective, you name it. I think all of us are quite sure that whatever we plan now, in 5 years from now, we'll probably have to revisit. So then the idea of PPPs is that, in a way, they can help us look at all of these risks and assess who is better prepared to deal with certain risks than other people. And when we talk about risk, this can be financial, so we talk about availability of funds. We can talk about delivery and the likelihood of delays, of budget overruns, technical difficulties. We can talk about social and environmental impact, whether this means ESG compliance, negative public reactions. We can talk about operations and what it means to not meet the expected quality or like the expected delivery of a certain project, market demand, uncertainty about the number of users and financial sustainability, or even political and regulatory part where we talk about legislative changes. I guess in Romania we're quite familiar with that. So then the point with PPPs is that an effective PPP essentially is going to be able to look at whom from the public or the private sector is better prepared to deal with what type of risk. And obviously this is kind of project dependent, but most of the times the public sector is a lot more, let's say, prepared to deal with financial risk because they do have a bit of a, let's say, backup in terms of the money that comes from the public sphere. Social and environmental one because they're the ones who kind of have to comply to a lot stricter regulations, and political and regulatory because they're the ones influencing it. At the same time, the private sector is perhaps the one better suited to deal with risks that have to do with delivery because they have the resources and the expertise to deliver in more of an efficient way. Operational, because they basically have, let's say, the quality check and quality control on what's going to be delivered, and the market demand, because they have a lot more flexibility to adapt their business models to different needs in the market, right? So now I'm quite curious to see from those of you in the room, what do you think would be the benefits of doing a PPP? If you are to think from your perspective, whether you're coming from the public sector, whether you're coming from the private sector, whether you're an organization or, I don't know, NGO, association facilitating or interested in this, what do you think are the benefits that would be tied to whoop, we lost the, I think we lost the, okay, cool. Can we go back to the slide? It's fine. Okay, we lost the Menti. So then maybe I can ask you in the room and try to make it a bit more interactive. I'm going to come down from the stage. What do you think are some of the benefits from doing a PPP? I'm going to ask you to cooperate, because otherwise it's going to be very awkward. Yes, please. Do we have a mic, maybe? So this is innovation in the making. This was meant to be on the stage. Now it's off the stage. We're adapting it. Thank you. Funcționează? Da? Super. Thank you, and hello. Nice to see you.
Hello, everyone.
Yes.
I'm Janette Verrijzer. I represent the government of the Netherlands. And from my experience, I can say the first reason would be to share the risk between the public and the private sector.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Anyone else? So we've had someone kind of representing, let's say, the public sector from an embassy perspective. Anyone else who would like to share? I'm getting the looks.
I think. Hello, I'm representing NGO and an organization that is focusing on this kind of public-private partnerships. I think one of the main benefits of this partnership is innovating, because you are developing new ways and you are breaking practically bubbles when you are working with the public-private sector. So yeah, I think innovation is one of the benefits.
Okay, so the opportunity to basically do something new. I'm going to try the third table here as well, please. Yes, I'm seeing they're pointing to you, so you're going to have to tell me something. I'm sorry.
Yes, hello.
You're the boss.
Yes, I hope so. I'm from Real Estate Magazine.
Okay.
We have covered this topic in our magazine and online as well. And I've been writing about PPP for like a decade already. Back then, we were talking about having a PPP legislation here in Romania. I think we have it. The problem is that we don't have enough projects, because we are lacking confidence between the state and public-private actors. And of course, foreign institutions, foreign investors can help, but I think this is the main challenge we have here. We don't have enough trust from what I've been talking to companies. And okay, this event can help as well to raise awareness about this framework. But yes, I think going forward, now that we have a new president as well, which is more pro-market, maybe we have more projects on this side. So.
Cool. Amazing. Thank you. Well, okay, nice. Yes, round of applause, please. Thank you so much. So I guess, yeah, the main point why we're talking about this today, and as you are saying, it's about the awareness part, is that we've realized, well, I don't need both of them, I guess. We've realized the same thing, is that actually you do have, let's say, the technicalities in place to be able to run public-private partnerships, and I'm going to have a resource for you at the end. In terms of Romania, the Ministry of Finance has put together solid guidance on how to do PPPs. But at the same time, this lack of trust between the public and the private sector essentially also means that we don't necessarily have interesting or innovative projects when it comes to these PPPs. Most of the times, we talk about quite the standard solutions of like contracts and services, and we don't really go into anything that's a bit more innovative. So you'll see on your table, there's a copy of a guide that we've recently put together, Best Practice Guide for Public-Private Partnerships. And the point of this guide and what we were trying to develop essentially was trying to look at what's happening in the sphere of PPPs at a European level and what are the main types of mechanism of public-private partnerships that can be mobilized to support with the development of greener, more sustainable cities in the future. What are the mechanisms, how do they work, and also what are examples of best practices from across Europe that we can look at and understand how they work to basically be able to take the lessons home. And in terms of how these private partnerships works, and I'm going to give you a very short overview. Essentially, they vary depending on the level of involvement, the responsibilities assumed by each entity. It can go from responsibility lying a lot more with the public sector, so the type of public works and service contracts that are quite the standards, let's say, type of, they're not necessarily PPPs, there's not much of a partnership there actually, it's more of a contracting, to the full privatization and the full responsibility lying with the private sector. The PPPs are essentially somewhere in the middle of these two opposite directions of the spectrum. And essentially deciding on how and what type of, let's say, public-private partnerships you want to do depends on a few factors. It depends on the investment period, because we can talk about different models when we talk about something that's as short-term as 1 to 5 years and is more of, like, let's say, an operational project or service, to something that might be a long-term project infrastructure, as you are saying, where you have the big risks that need to be shared when we talk about a span of 15 plus years. We have to talk about investment cost as well, depending on whether it's small investments that usually are, let's say, covered under what's known as operational expenditure, so OPEX part that usually goes into operational costs for primarily services, or we're talking more about large investment, capital expenditures, the CapEx part that talks a lot about the construction, the building of infrastructure, and so on. Depending on these two, you're going to want to go with different mechanisms. Also, we have to talk about the available resources, depending on what you want to do and depending on what types of resources you need, whether you need technological know-how, whether you need public assets such as land, for example, buildings or infrastructure, whether you need market and network access that can be provided by different private partners. And finally, obviously, a type of PPP will need to be defined depending on the deliverable at the end of the day, because the deliverable can either be hard infrastructure, as probably a lot of, let's say, the more standard PPPs are, where you're starting to build something new, or it can be about soft infrastructure. And that's where we go a lot in the space of process, of ecosystem, of innovation, social innovation, and so on. And what I want to leave you with, and this is kind of going to be the main part, you're also going to have it in the guides on the table, is that we've tried to basically map this whole landscape at a European level, and we've identified 4 main categories of public-private partnerships that kind of differ in terms of the risk associated with them, the type of service, the type of deliverable, so to say, that is developed, whether it's more towards the softer part or more towards the infrastructure and hard part. And these fall into 4 categories. The social impact and public innovation, where we talk about collaboration between the public and the private for the collective good of the community. We talk about large investment projects, which are the ones, the standard ones, so to say, where we're talking about designing and financing major urban projects with the support and the funding primarily coming from the private sector. We're talking about public services and operation, where a lot of the focus is on how do we improve essential services without fully privatizing them. And finally, the smart financing and incentives, where we're looking at how can you use different types of financing model to be able to bring projects to the table, whether these are hard infrastructure ones or most often the, let's say, the softer components ones as well. So I'm going to very quickly take you through what this can look like in practice. You have the guys, and you can kind of shuffle through them on the table as well if you want to look at them. So the public services and operation, as I was saying, these are, let's say, maybe some of the common and less partnership-oriented. They're more like contracting, essentially, where we're looking at how we can improve essential services. Most of the times here you have private companies who help manage public services without actually owning them. And they do that by either operating and improving services, and the state basically in the background remains the owner of this. And this can take the form of service contracts, whether we're talking about, for example, waste management or water systems, where a private entity is being brought into the game to operate this on behalf of the state. Or we can talk about concessions. For example, in the case of the bridges in Lisbon, where basically the state can essentially lend you or give you access to a certain public good, whether it's on a building, on infrastructure, or a land for a certain period of time, while you as a private actor can basically take it and decide to run it and operate it. These are, let's say, the more standard ones that fall under usual contracting services. You then have the big investment PPPs, and the majority of PPP model probably falls under this. And these are the ones that take a lot of various different forms. Here it's quite a, let's say, complex landscape that you can navigate with a lot of abbreviations. It can go from private companies basically investing in public infrastructure by financing it, by constructing it, by operating it, by owning it for a while, by giving it back to the state afterwards. It can take a lot of different forms. And you have a few of these models here listed on the slide. So you can have building, operating, and transferring back to the public. You can build, own, operate, and transfer back. You can build, own, and then just operate. You can build, transfer, and operate. Like, essentially, at the end of the day, these types of mechanisms essentially can be quite easily adapted depending on the needs of the public sector and of the private sector. And I guess I want to give you a really interesting example that I find quite fascinating is the last one here on this slide, the rehabilitation of railway infrastructure in Croatia, which I found was quite an interesting case study. Basically, in their case, a private consortium financed and upgraded key sections of the rail network, basically only owning that infrastructure during the contracting period where they were in charge of actually improving it, and leasing it to the state railway in the meantime so that they can continue running the operation. At the moment that the modernization of the railway finished, basically the upgraded infrastructure was transferred back to the state as their property, and then basically the private actor was only kind of kept into the loop in terms of like minimal maintenance. So essentially this was a really smart way of ensuring that something that would otherwise take a lot of time if the railway infrastructure were to stay with the public sector, for them to be able to get all of the permits, all of the approbations, all of the stuff for them to be able to modernize, by transferring it into the private property for a limited period of time for the private consortium to be able to modernize the railway. It then happened a lot quicker. People could continue using the railway at the same time, and the state had access to it, and then they got the whole thing modern and kind of finalized back at the end of the period. So all of these things can be quite an interesting way to kind of play with different models. Third category, the one I mentioned with the smart financing and incentives, essentially here we're looking at how can you use incentives and taxes and partnerships so that you can finance projects better. And a lot of the things here revolve around subsidies, grants, tax incentives, user fees, revenue model sharing, public land monetization. So essentially, how can you do better with the assets that you have to generate more money in the process and public value at the same time. And a good example here, for example, coming from both Germany and also Amsterdam, is looking at how can you give grants and subsidies to businesses so that they can align themselves and their initiatives and projects to the strategies that have been adopted by cities. So in the case of Amsterdam, for example, that means businesses and startups aligning to the circular economy strategy that the city has, and they've basically set up these grants for circular businesses where different types of enterprises can benefit from support from the city if their activities align with this strategy. And finally, the last category, if my clicker is also working, is the social impact and public innovation. And here is, let's say, the interesting part where a lot of creativity comes in, I guess, where we're looking at these collaborations between public and private for the collective good of the community of the cities. Probably not a lot of you would have thought, but CSR initiatives essentially do fall under public-private partnerships, although they perhaps are not the standard large investment, big risk type of partnerships, but they are a type of public-private partnership. We talk here about philanthropy as well and foundations. We talk about social impact bonds, public development agencies, and innovation partnerships. So here it's a really interesting mix of both hard and soft projects that can happen. I mean, in Romania, for example, here we can talk about building hospitals from private money, that essentially it is a public-private partnership at the end of the day. We can talk about the types of, let's say, agencies that manage certain services on behalf of city halls or local authorities. For example, District 6 that has recently set up their division running kind of the entertainment and the public culture and arts for the district of Bucharest. So there are a lot of different examples where you have this type of collaboration that perhaps is not necessarily seen as a PPP until now. So you'll be able to find all of these things in the guide on the table. Also, you'll see there that we have a few more resources, and I know you are mentioning the fact that we now have guidance on how to actually set up PPPs. A really good guide that we do recommend for you to be looking at is the one from the Ministry of Finance in Romania, where they've essentially condensed a lot of the best practices where it comes to the legal and the financial part of how to set up contracts for public-private partnerships. That's available online. It's kind of open to use and open to access. Obviously, that's at the stage where you've already identified that you want to do a public-private partnership. You kind of know what type of project you want to do, and then you get into the weeds of how to actually set it up. At the same time, with the public-private partnerships, I guess the main point is to start thinking what type of projects you want to do and how to think about them in, let's say, more of a creative way and more of an innovative way. Because essentially that's where, let's say, the harder part it is for a lot of the public sector like initiatives in a way. And for that, I wanted to basically flag two initiatives that we have been doing over the last couple of years. One of them is Urban Lab for Green Cities, which essentially it's a national program for innovating for climate neutral cities in Romania. A few of you here in the room have actually been alongside us in this journey, and we're very grateful for that. It's a really good space for actually testing and coming together with different actors to see how perhaps solutions or projects that are kind of initiated from the local citizens can actually then be taken forward through a public-private partnership in the future. And at the same time, as I was talking about the climate neutrality part and the importance of innovation in this space, one resource that I would recommend you looking at is the M100 Mirror Mission Hub Romania platform, which is the national platform for climate neutrality. We have 3 cities that are part of the European mission: Bucharest District 2, Suceava, and Cluj-Napoca, and 10 new cities that have been selected as part of the national mission. And for them, we've been running over the last year capacity building programs for climate neutrality, essentially looking at just that. How do you innovate for the climate transition, and how do you mobilize ecosystems of change at a local level? How do you bring public and private people together, and how do you build that trust that we currently perhaps don't necessarily have at too good of a level? So I think this was primarily it for me here in terms of public-private partnerships. I'd invite you to have a look at the guides on the table. You can take them home with you. And I'm going to open up for questions if there are any other questions. And also, you can scan the QR here and get the guide online. It's also up on our website if you want to consult it. I'm going to get the mic and see if there are any questions from you. Thank you. It's fine. No. Any questions? Anyone wants to share anything? OK, perhaps not. So yeah, you can scan the QR code. You have a question. Thank you. You have a question.
Hi. So my question for you would be, do you have any examples of PPPs that have already happened in Romania, or are there any that you know that are going to happen in the short term?
Yeah, so basically, as I was saying, I think, maybe I'll leave you with the mic and I'll speak here so that it's not. You have two types. One of them is more, let's say, the general type of contracts that look at how you manage services. So, for example, a few of the districts and a few of the cities have had this in terms of the management of public markets, where basically the municipality is coming with the land and maybe the infrastructure of a market, and then you have a private company that is the one operating it and doing the maintenance and investing with it. You have quite a few cities that are usually doing that. Those have been happening for quite a few years. Then on the other side, let's say the more innovative side, is what I was talking about, different financing models and CSR. So for the financing model, for example, it's this example that I gave with hospitals built from private money. Essentially, at the end of the day, it is a PPP because you have the private entities putting together resources to build the infrastructure on a land that is being given to them by the state, and then the whole kind of facility is being run by the state, so it is a PPP. And also you can look at different types of CSR initiatives that are kind of in the benefit of the community and the city, so to say, and they are kind of run with private money on public land. So for example, that you have in Oradea, in Cluj, and I think a few other cities, small parklets or small green spaces in cities that are being maintained by and adopted by private companies. Essentially, the city gives them to private actors. The private actor each takes one plot, they invest money in it, they do a bit of branding and promoting, they look after them. The green spaces essentially are good to use by people. They also get some basically publicity in return, and the city is happy. So this can be different types. So I guess, yeah, we do have examples, but perhaps they're not the most obvious ones, so then we don't really know about them. Cool. Thank you. Any other question? If not, I'm going to let you have a breather until the next session. OK, cool. Thank you so much.